Hello, everyone. Welcome to another recorded lecture for human nutrition. We are going to start on energy balance for chapter 10. This is a very long chapter, so I'm going to break it up into smaller parts so you don't have to listen to the whole thing all at once. We usually cover this chapter in at least 2 or 3 lecture sessions, so I'll warn you about that from the beginning. These are the learning objectives for the entire chapter. I will read them to you very quickly. We're going to start out talking about energy balance and the uses of energy in the body. We're going to compare methods used to measure energy expenditure by the body. So thinking about how many calories does one burn and how do we know that? We're going to talk about internal and external regulation of hunger, appetite, and satiety. So those are, those feelings we have that we're hungry, the feelings that we have that we're full and satisfied, and what exactly controls that. We're going to go over different methods for assessing body composition and determining whether body weight and composition are healthy. We are going to talk about the impact of genetics and environment on body weight and composition, and go over the key components of programs designed to treat overweight and obesity. We're going to discuss the characteristics of fad diets. The biggest one right now is probably keto. We're going to evaluate weight loss programs to determine whether they are safe and likely to result in long-term weight loss. And then we're going to end on eating disorders. So what are you looking at here? The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is a map of coronavirus, but that is not what you're looking at. These are areas and percentages of the people who have obesity. So if you look at Massachusetts in the blue, 20 to 25% of adults in Massachusetts have obesity. So the orange and of course red colors are the highest rates. I believe this is actually a little bit outdated. I think we have a couple more red states now. But the main point is, of course, that more and more people, particularly adults in this country, fit the criteria for obesity. So it is considered a public health problem. If you look at the 2 highest states, which, oh geez, geography is not my thing. I think it's West Virginia and Mississippi, or is that Alabama? If you think about why that might be, we'll talk about in this lecture. Why do we see high rates of obesity in certain pockets? Is it genetics? Is it lifestyle? If you don't know already, it's certainly a combination of a variety of factors. But it's interesting to think about and important to think about because we do want to try and make people as healthy as we possibly can. Energy balance is incredibly complex, but I'm going to describe it in a really simple way to get us started. And so when we think about energy balance, we're talking about the energy that we intake. So think about calories, that's the energy that we intake, and the energy that we expend or burn. So energy balance is the relationship between energy intake and energy expenditure. If we are in equilibrium, that is someone whose body weight is staying about the same. So we all go up and down a couple pounds through water retention and things like that. But if your body weight is for the most part stable, you are in equilibrium. So the calories that you consume match the amount of energy you expend. If you have been gaining weight, you are in positive energy balance. So the energy intake exceeds energy expenditure, right? So simple words, you're eating more than you are burning. If you are in negative energy balance, that means you are losing weight. So negative, the scale's going down. That's how I always remember it. That's when energy intake is less than energy expenditure. So you're eating less than you are burning. And if you really think about that, if you don't take in enough energy to sort of support your daily life and your daily activity, then your body has to burn stored energy. And we have stored energy mostly as body fat. So if you're trying to lose weight, if you're on a diet, you want to be in negative energy balance. You want to eat less than you need, so your body's forced to burn your stored body fat for energy. Now, we are in different phases of energy balance at different points in our life. We are gaining weight. We are in positive energy balance in a couple of key moments. These are almost always associated with growth. So in pregnancy, you're growing another human life. Infancy, childhood, and adolescence, the teen years, you are putting on body mass, you are getting taller, you are putting on more muscle. This is normal and expected. And usually during these times, people have to consume more energy. They have to eat more calories to get themselves into that positive energy balance. Aging does not cause weight gain, although it certainly can feel like it for most people, because a lot of people do gain weight as they get older. But this is stemming from a pattern of excess food intake coupled with limited physical activity and slower metabolism. So as we get older, our metabolism slows down. We don't need as many calories, but if we still consume the same amount as we did when we were younger, sometimes even more, we will see weight gain. And negative energy balance is desired in adults when body fatness exceeds healthy levels. So we put ourselves in a negative energy balance sometimes on purpose if we are trying to lose weight. This is not recommended during growth stages. So if you're pregnant or a kid or a teenager, it's would be very rare, very, very rare that we would ever want you to be in negative energy balance. If you prefer the picture form of what I just said, this is it. I like that it includes numbers. So in that first example of a kind of youngish, middle-aged man who might be taking in 3,000 calories a day, that maybe sound like a lot, but if he's burning a lot of calories because he's physically active, he also needs a certain amount of calories just to live, he's going to be in energy equilibrium. Then you can see the example of a woman who's been gaining weight. She's consuming 4,000 calories, but she really only needs 2,000. So her weight's going to increase. And then the negative energy balance, where someone's eating about 2,000 calories, but they're very active, they're burning more than that, they're going to lose weight. So there's a couple ways we can try and estimate both sides of the equation. So the energy intake part, you maybe have estimated before if you've ever tried to figure out how many calories you consume. So if you kind of wondered, well, where does that information come from? The amount of energy or calories in food or beverages can be estimated using nutrient databases or software. Now, this has been recorded. Most of this information is free. Just recognize that at one point in a laboratory, the calorie values were derived directly by using a bomb colorimeter. So we had talked about that earlier in the semester, where you can put food in a device. Here it is on the next page. This is a bomb colorimeter. It looks like we're trying to figure out the energy in peas or Brussels sprouts. I don't know. But that food, when the temperature goes up, it will increase the temperature in that bomb colorimeter even more because the food is giving off energy. So we've done this with a variety of foods. So anytime you enter the information into a software program like you have to do for this class, they will estimate the number of calories for you. You have done this already, I believe, in exam 1, where you calculated calorie content when you know the grams of energy producing macronutrients And if you know the grams of alcohol, you can multiply these compounds by their physiological values. So if you had pure fat, you took a tablespoon of oil, and you know that oil has 9 calories per gram. If you know how many grams of fat were in that oil, say it was 9, then you just multiplied the two things to get the total calories. 9 times 9, 81. Okay, so we can measure how much energy we take in by estimating how many calories we eat. We can also estimate, usually estimate, energy expenditure. So how many calories does our body use on a daily basis? So we need energy to stay alive. Our basal metabolism certainly is a big user of energy. Whenever we're physically active, we are using energy. Whenever we digest, absorbs, and process ingested nutrients, which is known as a thermal effect of food, we use energy. We also use a little bit of energy through something called thermogenesis. Anytime we sort of fidget or we shiver because we're trying to keep our body temperature in the correct range, we also use energy. So this is a different way, this picture on the bottom, of showing energy balance. I actually kind of like it because it's showing you all the different food components that contain energy. So fat, carbs, proteins, and alcohol. If you add up all the calories from those things, you know your energy intake. And then the other side, the energy expenditure, is going to come from your basal metabolism, the thermic effect of food, so digesting and processing food, physical activity, and thermogenesis. I'm going to take a little bit deeper dive into energy expenditure. So I'm sure you've all heard metabolism before, and some of us talked about that when we reviewed chapter 9. But basal metabolism is the minimum amount of energy expended in fasting to keep a resting, awake body alive in a warm, quiet environment. Isn't that a funny definition? So, in my own words, I would say if you were sitting down and not moving, and it was just a nice, warm, calm place, you still expend energy because you have to stay alive. You actually expend a lot of energy just staying alive. It accounts for most of us for 60 to 70% of all of our energy needs, or our total energy expenditure. So what are we expending energy for? Just physiological processes. So beating of the heart, respiration of the lungs, activity of the other organs. This is what drives our basal metabolic rate. Sometimes when we estimate basal metabolism, if someone's not fasted or rested, we could use resting metabolism. I think most of us would probably like to have a high metabolism, especially if we have to work a little bit at maintaining our weight. Some people have a very high metabolism, and it's actually difficult for them to gain weight. They have the opposite problem. But there's many things that go into one's basal metabolism. Certainly sort of body composition. So the more muscle you have, the higher your basal metabolic rate will be. A larger body surface, so larger people have a higher basal metabolism. Men tend to have a higher metabolism than women. Body temperature. So if your body temperature is a little bit high, especially even if you have a fever or something like that, it's going to increase. Levels of thyroid hormone can impact this. Nervous system activity. Just think about someone who is a bit more twitchy and fidgety. growth stages, of course. So kids tend to need to eat a lot relative to their body weight because they want to be in positive energy balance. Caffeine and tobacco increase our basal metabolic rate a bit, although I certainly don't recommend starting smoking to do that. It's dangerous. And recent exercise. So you may have heard even after you stop exercising, your metabolic rate will remain increased for a little while. And that's what this is referring to. So what can lower our metabolic rate? Having low levels of certain thyroid hormones can. Restricted calorie intake. So sometimes when we sort of starve ourselves or eat less, it lowers our metabolic rate, which can be annoying if you're trying to lose weight. If you're a smaller person, you have less muscle mass, your metabolic rate will be lower. And again, one of the not so fun parts of aging is right around your 30th birthday, your basal metabolic rate will start to decline a little bit. And will keep doing that as you get older. I also kind of want to point out that you'll hear a lot of things that promise to boost your metabolism. For the most part, these are very physiologically controlled, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. Energy for physical activity, you have a lot of control over, though. So depending on how much your activity is, you can increase your energy expenditure above basal by 25 to 40%. So being active or inactive determines much of your total energy expenditure. So this isn't always just going to the gym or going out and exercising. You know, you want to be thinking about energy you use just as part of your daily life. So climbing the stairs instead of the elevator, walking rather than driving, standing rather than sitting. You know, these aren't the type of changes where you're going to lose 5 pounds overnight, but if you make an effort to do them every day over time, it will start to add up and make a difference. As a matter of fact, there's many reasons why we have higher increased rates of obesity in North America, but some of these small things that have added up over time are certainly part of that problem. Thermic effective food is another component of energy expenditure. So again, we use energy when we digest, absorb, transport, store, and metabolize food. I've even heard people talk about low-calorie foods like lettuce, that's mostly water. The amount of energy it takes to chew and digest that food is actually greater than the amount of energy in the food itself. So in fact, about 5 to 10% of the energy we use just comes from processing that food. And of course, some food composition items are more difficult for the body to process than others. So protein, we actually talked about this when we did protein, is more difficult for the body to break down and process, mostly because of the nitrogen that's in protein. Carbohydrates are easier. Fat is actually the easiest. It's also influenced by the size of the meal. So a big meal, you're putting more strain on your body and the energy to process it. But keep in mind that a big meal probably has a lot of energy, so it balances out to some extent. Adaptive thermogenesis. So think about genesis, you're creating something, and in this case, thermo refers to heat. So how does our body create heat? It is able to, of course, but this is a very small contribution to total energy expenditure. It's produced when the body expends energy for non-voluntary physical activity. So you're really, really cold, you've just overeaten, trauma, starvation, all of those things are not physical activity, but they do require energy. So I think we can very easily think about how you measure energy intake and how many calories you consume. Measuring energy expenditure can be a little bit more difficult. We have some scientific ways to do that, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. So direct and indirect calorimetry is really thinking about how we measure how a body's energy expenditure, so how much heat is being given off. Um, and for most of us, we don't have access to calorimetry tools, but we can estimate our energy expenditure just using mathematical equations. So most of the equations that we use take into account your height, weight, physical activity, and age. I would also put gender onto that list, I think is missing. And that will tell us about how much energy we need to stay alive. Here's our more direct ways, though, just to give you a sense of how that does this. That weird little picture on the side there where the person looks like they're running, that is direct calorimetry. So we have not very many of these because they're very expensive, but in some research facilities, you can put someone in an insulated chamber surrounded by water, and it measures the change in temperature within that chamber, which is directly measuring how much energy is given off by that person. So the heat that's coming off their body is directly the direct energy expenditure. It's almost like putting a human in a bomb calorimeter, the same way we measure heat and food, although obviously we're not blowing the person up. And this is the most accurate way to measure energy expenditure. This is why we know that about 60% of the energy we use is just coming from just physiological processes. Indirect calorimetry is more available to the average person. It's indirect because it's not measuring the heat coming off the body. It's actually measuring expired air. So think about breathing out. There is a very predictable relationship between the body's use of energy and the amount of oxygen consumed and carbon dioxide produced. So if you look at that picture, that you can see that that woman kind of has a large mask and there's a tube going into it. And so that machine that's connected to the computer is measuring the amount of oxygen she's taking in and the carbon dioxide she's breathing out. And we can relate that to how much energy she uses. We can do this at rest. We can also do it while people exercise. They also make smaller handheld machines that we do this. We actually have all of these fun tools at the university in our health assessment lab. This is how the vast majority of us, though, will measure energy expenditure. We would do it by an estimate. And that is based on an equation. So here's where we actually have the full list: height, weight, gender, age, and physical activity. I've given you two equations that you could use to estimate your energy expenditure. You just have to plug in your own information about your age, weight, and height. That equation is going to give you your resting energy expenditure. When you're done with it, you have to look at that bottom box, which is your physical activity estimates. So say you plug the information into the equation and it says 1500. That's again resting or an estimate of basal. You'd have to multiply that by the physical activity estimate. So if you're an active person and you think that you walk, the equivalent of 7 miles a day, you'd have to multiply that by, I can't see it, it's blocked. I should use that example. It's probably about 1.2, I'm guessing. If you were very active, you'd multiply it by 1.48 if you were a man and 1.45 if you were a woman. And once you do the multiplier, the physical activity, that gives you your total energy expenditure that you have estimated as close as you can. This is a table just also estimating your energy expenditure without having to do any math. It's just taking population averages. So if you are a 20-year-old woman and you're kind of sedentary, you don't do a lot of physical activity, you need about 2,000 calories a day. And if you're active, probably closer to 2,400. All of these are estimates. This is an even looser estimate. You really kind of want to think about, for you personally, how much are you eating and is your body weight staying the same? Yeah, everybody's going to be a little bit different. Next, we're going to talk about eating behavior regulation. So think about what you eat and why you eat it and when you eat what you do. A lot of times we feel like that's a very conscious choice, but hunger and satiety, at least, are somewhat of a regulated thing. So something that our body has some control over. So hunger absolutely is physiological. That's in the definition. Physiological drive to find and eat food. So I actually feel a little bit hungry right now. I haven't eaten in a while. There's probably not any food in my stomach or my intestines. And I feel hungry. I feel kind of empty. My energy's a little bit low. So that's physiological. That's not just made up in my head. So our body has a way of regulating that. Our organs, especially our digestive organs, and a whole slew of hormones and hormone-like factors communicate with our nervous system. So right now there's something in my stomach. There's a couple things in my stomach that are able to communicate with my brain and say, hey, there's no food here. And I have to eat at some point, right? Otherwise, I'm going to starve to death. So that brain of yours needs that information, and it's going to make you feel hungry, make you want to find food, because if you starve to death, right, you're not going to be alive anymore. So it's a very much part of health and internally driven. Appetite's a little bit different. Appetite is psychological. So even though I have physical hunger at this particular moment, which for me right now is around dinner time, my family sits down and eats, and I want dinner. So I want protein and a whole grain and a vegetable because I'm a boring nutrition professor. And I have an idea of what I want to eat. And some of that is not physiological, but more psychological. So both of these are going on at the same time, right? We have internal and external signals that operate simultaneously to lead us to decide whether to reject or eat food. And of course, we can override these signals all we want, and certainly humans do that all the time. So good examples of overriding those signals: you're totally full and have eaten plenty, but you still have dessert, right? That's not physiological, that's psychological. You're eating because you want something and it looks good. On the other end of the spectrum, you have physiological hunger. Your stomach is empty, it's growling, you're cranky, but we still don't eat because your mom just made kale chips and that sounds disgusting to you. So we ultimately have the choice of course, of whether we eat or don't eat and what we choose to eat. But satiety is kind of an interesting concept. So when we fulfill either one of these drives, we feel like we're in a state of satiety, meaning that we're satisfied and we don't want to eat. So the main area of our nervous system, our brain, is the hypothalamus. That's where all of these signals are ultimately ending up, and really where energy balance is physiologically controlled. So if you think about how you feel satisfied, right? You're fine. You don't need to eat. A lot of things go into that. So the sensory aspects of food, how it tastes, how it feels in your mouth, even knowing that we've eaten, that knowledge can make us feel satisfied. Physical things like chewing, and then other physical things that we don't have immediate control over, like our stomach and intestines working to digest food. It says here, low energy dense foods promote satiety. So a low energy dense food like an apple, right? Most of our fruits and vegetables don't have a lot of calories or energy in them. We chew them up. It takes a while to have them. They have more fiber, so the body has to work a little bit harder. Sometimes those can make us feel satisfied, even though they don't have a lot of calories or energy. And of course, along with that, digestion, absorption, and metabolism. We have some hormones that shut off hunger. So these hormones are triggered when you have eaten. They actually are chemical messengers that tell your brain, hey, there's food here. You can stop now. You don't need to eat anymore. And you recognize cholecystokinin. We talked about CCK in our digestion and absorption lectures. So this hormone has a lot of roles, but we use this hormone, or it's secreted when we've eaten. And so one of its other jobs is, again, to tell our brain that there's food in the system and we don't have to eat anymore. Glucagon-like peptide and peptide YY are another examples of hormones that work very similar to CCK. Now, ghrelin is an interesting hormone. That one's actually made by your stomach. And ghrelin makes you feel hungry. So when your stomach's empty, it tells your brain, hey, I need to eat something. So when there's a decrease in ghrelin, right, it goes down, it produces short-term satiety. So when you don't have ghrelin, you feel satisfied and you don't want to eat. This slide is talking about satisfaction or satiety. You can see where the hypothalamus is within the brain. The cortex is another region of the brain that is more involved with sort of conscious thinking or decision making. And that schematic there is repeating what we've already talked about, the different things that are happening when you eat, that talk to your brain and tell it that there's food there, and that we can stop eating. We also have long-term satiety. So this isn't like, oh, I just had dinner and now I'm full. This is more what happens over the course of days and weeks. So another part of our body that talks to our brain is actually our body fat, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But the amount of body fat you have is giving your brain some information about how much stored energy there is. So the most famous example of that is a hormone called leptin. So your adipose tissue, which is your fat tissue, makes leptin. It makes a hormone, and it tells your brain to reduce food intake, which is supposed to help you manage your weight, right? So if you think about that, right? The more fat you have, the more stored energy you have, the more leptin you make, and the leptin's supposed to be telling your brain to stop eating. Some more about these signals to eat. So say it's been a long time. It's been several hours after you last ate. So obviously there's no food in your system. The concentration of macronutrients fall, and your body's starting to use energy from other stores. So your glycogen, your stored carbohydrate, your fat, your stored triglyceride. And this is going to cause those feelings of satiety to diminish or lessen, because you're not satisfied anymore. Now you're going to the other end where you're starting to feel hungry. So now we have different hormones and endorphins that stimulate appetite and increase food intake. So two examples of those hormones are cortisol and ghrelin, which I just mentioned in an earlier slide. These are to protect us from starving to death. They're reminding us that, hey, we need some energy. All right, so we're doing a lot of estimating today. We estimated energy intake, so calories we eat, energy expenditure, calories we burn. Now we're talking about something different. We're talking about estimating body weight and composition. So what's sort of the outcome of our energy intake and our energy expenditure? So a long time ago, this table you see down there is from 1983. And in fact, for about 50 years, this is how they estimated if somebody had a good body weight. So it looked at humans, broke it down into men and women and their height and their frame size. So kind of think about if you've got big bones or small bones. And they put down what weight range is associated with the most health and living a long life. It was actually data from health insurance companies, life insurance companies. So now we don't use tables anymore. We're trying to be a little bit more exact and think about body weight and the relative proportions. So instead of just looking at a table, we try and think about our total body fat, where that fat is located on our body, and whether or not we have any weight-related medical problems. Body fat, not all body fat is created equal, I guess. Let's put it that way. The most common way we estimate body fat is something called BMI, or body mass index. It is the weight for height standard that is used, every time you go to the doctor, they probably calculate your BMI, whether you know it or not. It's extremely convenient because it doesn't require really any fancy equipment, and the math is pretty simple. It is one equation for both men and women. So you can use either one. It just depends on if you know your weight in kilograms and your height in meters, or if you know your weight in pounds and your height in inches. So I promise you, you will have to know something about BMI on the exam. Just to familiar with it, if you've never done it before, I would plug in your information and calculate your BMI just so you're comfortable with the equation. Now this is cheating. This is, I don't want to do the math and I'm just going to look it up. So once you do the math, you can use this chart and figure out if you did the math right. So you can line up your height in inches and your weight in pounds. And then if you go to the top there, that 19, 20, 21, all the way through 40, that's the BMI number. That's the number you should get when you use the equation. And then it's going to tell you what that number means. So this is that same information in a little bit easier to read format. And it is breaking down that BMI, that number you get when you do the equation, into categories. So if your BMI is less than 18.5, you are considered underweight. If you're 18.5 to 25, you're healthy. 25 to 30 is overweight. And this is where you might start to have health risks because of your weight. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have too much fat, however, right? We're not measuring fat, we're just looking at height and weight. Obese, which is a word most of us don't really want to hear, but medically, it only means that your BMI is over 30. So these numbers are not perfect. They're certainly not appropriate for everyone. Younger people, pregnant women, women who are breastfeeding or lactating, their body composition is changing. They're growing. Where they need to be is relative to what's going on physiologically, and we don't use BMI. The picture over there is making another point about BMI. It is not measuring body composition, right? It's just estimating based on height and weight. So those two men both weigh 250 pounds, and they're both 6 feet tall. So if you plug that into the BMI equation, they're both going to come out at 33.9, which is considered obese. Obviously, one has more body fat than the other. So keep that in mind when you calculate your BMI. It is just a number, and you need to have more information to know whether or not it is a health problem or not. Now, if you do know your exact body fat, if you have a way to measure that, 8 to 24% is considered ideal for a man. Over 24% is considered obese. For women, 21 to 35 is ideal. Over 35% considered obese. Women are usually higher in body fat than men. They actually need extra fat for reproduction. So in order to make babies, whether you plan on having children or not, physiologically, women will have more body fat because of that. To measure body fat, both weight and body volume must be measured. So think about volume, right? How much space you're kind of taking up. So we have some fancy tools that are better than BMI that will help you sort of assess body composition. So the first one's underwater weighing. It's exactly what it sounds like. We take your body weight underwater and in air. We can do it. And then we use a formula. Because fat has a different density than lean tissues, when you weigh someone underwater or in air, you can figure out how much your body is fat and how much is muscle and how much is bone. We also have some tools, devices that measure air displacement. So you go into a sealed chamber and it can detect how much space you're taking up, which they can use equations to estimate your body composition. So here's some pictures. Underwater weighing. I've never done it. I've seen it being done. It doesn't look very fun. So they are taking her weight underwater and using equations related to density. The air displacement tool on the right is a BOD pod. That's probably a lot more pleasant and easy to measure body composition. Those are the high-tech ones. Here's kind of the low-tech ones that are going to measure body fat. Skin fold thickness, they just use calipers, those little things that pinch, and the pinchers will pull away, pinch the subcutaneous fat, the fat that's closer to the surface right under the skin. And you can use equations based on how much subcutaneous fat you can measure. Bioelectrical impedance is done a couple of different ways. It's relatively inexpensive and easy. It is painless, but it is a low energy electrical current that goes through the body. You cannot feel it, but we know that electrical resistance equals more adipose or fat tissue. So as that current moves through, if there's more resistance, it can detect that and know that the body fat's higher there and give you a percentage. DEXA, or dual energy X-ray, is actually extremely high tech. This is considered the gold standard, the most accurate way, and it uses X-ray technology. So once you get your X-ray, that scan can estimate your body fat, your fat-free soft tissue, so think about muscle, and your bone. So it can tell you if you've if your bone density is okay. It's actually a wonderful tool. We have one at the university. You do have to be careful though because it is an X-ray, so it can only be done with a trained technologist. All right, other things to think about when you're assessing your body fat distribution. So if your fat is in your upper body, it's considered android obesity. And this is where not all fat is created equal. So fat around your stomach, that's what they kind of mean by upper body, is around your organs, a lot of your organs, and it can cause damage. So that type of fat has been linked to cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes. We have more, at least in the younger years, more men who collect body fat in their abdominal region. People who have diets with a high glycemic load, so things that raise their blood sugar more alcohol, think of the slang term beer belly, smokers, and it's very easy to tell. We just measure your waist circumference. So if your waist circumference is over 40 inches in a man and over 35 in a female, you are collecting more body fat in your abdomen, and we know that that has greater health risk. Now, women who have different hormone levels than men are more likely to store fat in their lower body around their butt and thighs, and not so much in their stomach or their abdomen. However, after menopause, so think around about age 50 for a woman, her hormone levels change. Her estrogen goes lower, it falls. And that change means that more abdominal fat distribution in women. So actually her health risk goes up after menopause because of this. If you want other language that you might have heard of, people will talk about apple and pear. So that man is an apple. His waist circumference is over 40 inches. It's actually 44. That's also called android obesity or upper fat distribution, and that is the one that has more health risks. The woman whose waist is small, under 35, but does have maybe a greater diameter around her hips and thighs, but that's thought to be not as much of a health risk and something we wouldn't worry about as much. That is gynoid or pear-shaped. So what factors affect body weight and composition? If you're interested in nutrition, you may have thought about this at some point in your life. Why do some people gain weight and others don't? We know genetics plays a role. So just some facts. Children with no obese parents, so both parents are lean, have a 10% chance of becoming obese. So there's still a chance, but it's fairly low. If a child has one obese parent, risk increases to 40%. If both parents are obese, risk soars to 80%. So it's suggesting that there is at least some part that is genetic or inherited. The best evidence we have of the role of genetics actually comes from studies where they look at identical twins, right? So identical twins have the same genetic or DNA code. And there's been studies that show that identical twins who are raised apart, so in different environments, but same genes, they gain weight very similar. Right, so whenever you say, well, it runs in families, well, eating habits and behaviors are also going to be similar across a family. But in this research, if you take that out of it, if they grow up in different environments with different eating habits, but they have the same genes, their weight is still very similar. So it's studies like this that they came up with this figure. So genes account for 40 to 70% of weight differences. meaning that genetics accounts for a lot. You think about even 70%, that's a pretty big number. That means only 30% has to do with your lifestyle and your habits. So we know that, things like body type run in families. I know for sure that my mom and my grandmother and myself, we gain weight in the same place. So we tend to gain weight in our stomach before we gain weight in other places. We know that metabolic rate is somewhat genetically determined, and factors that affect hunger and satiety, even things that we crave or foods that we like, has some genetic background to it. If you are someone who feels like you gain weight easily, you might have heard the term thrifty metabolism, meaning that you tend to store energy more frugally. So your body seems to always be worried you're going to starve to death, so it stores it up, which can make weight management a lot more difficult. So along with that is a very well-known theory, the set point theory. And this set point theory says that we have a genetically predetermined body weight or fat content that is closely regulated, meaning that sort of where you fall in the weight spectrum is there for a reason. You were born with it, and your body has mechanisms in place to kind of keep you there. Most of this probably relates to the hypothalamus, that part of your brain that monitors the amount of body fat and tries to keep it constant over time. So other things that sort of go into sort of physiologically controlling your body weight, when your energy intake is reduced, so you're eating less, you produce less thyroid hormone, so your metabolism slows down. Right? So you didn't decide this, you didn't control this. This is just what's happening in your body when you don't eat as much. If you don't eat enough to maintain energy balance and you lose weight, your body over time becomes more efficient at storing fat. The set point theory can also work in the other way and prevent weight gain. So if you know someone who doesn't seem to have to work very hard and it seems like they eat more and they don't really exercise that much and they still don't have any weight issues, that also falls into the set point theory where your body tries to protect your body weight, even if your behaviors don't really seem to match up with what your body weight is. We also know, of course, that environment is a part of body weight. We know that body weight similarities among family members are from learned behaviors. Just think about it, right? You, especially within a family, you're eating about the same food. You probably have, similar portion sizes that everyone's grown accustomed to. You probably eat out about the same amount. If you think about our gene pool, so weight's genetically determined, but our genes don't change much. But obesity rates have changed a lot. So genetics isn't the only thing. Environment also plays a role in when we eat, what we eat, and how much we eat. So we can, override. Remember, we were talking about some of those signals. And unfortunately, our environment is often set up to cause us to override or eat more than we physiologically need to. So at the end of the day, remember that it's both things. It's genetics, it's an environment. They have a synergy, meaning that they work together. Both nature or genetics and nurture, the environment, are involved in body weight and composition. So on one hand, even if you do have a genetic predisposition for either one, so if you're genetically more likely to be lean because your parents are lean, you can still gain weight through environmental behavioral factors. And even if obesity tends to run in your family, it can be avoided. It's going to be harder. You're going to have to be more careful, but healthy diet and regular physical activity can certainly help with weight regulation. So here's a bucket list of all the different things that encourage excess body fat storage and obesity. So who might gain more weight as you get older? Um, Women have more fat stores than men, not necessarily, um, just doesn't necessarily mean unhealthy. Some of that is expected, but you can kind of read, about pregnancy and things like that. High calorie diet. So if you eat out a lot, you're going to store more. Sedentary or not exercising, weight history, social and behavioral factors, medications, where you live, and genetic differences. So for one of my jobs before I came to UMass Lowell, I mostly worked with people who wanted or needed to lose weight. And we used to talk about all of these things. So trying to understand what might have caused the weight gain in the first place. And it's a mix of the things that you see on this slide. So more complicated than sometimes we give it credit for. All right, so I'm going to take a little break so I don't burn out on these lectures, and we will pick up on this in the second video.